Good morning to those of you on Zoom. Let me begin by saying this is actually the third outing for this sermon in the last 5 days. And let me just take a moment or two by way of encouragement to explain why. Anthony and I never really hide the fact that we're Christians with neighbours, with friends or whoever. But it seems like if you mention you're a Christian or whatever, it's just like tumbleweed moment. Nobody's interested. Close it down. They just it's any other subject but. And we don't want to ram it down people's throats. And so it's a bit disheartening sometimes that folk appear to be so apathetic. I worked during COVID in an Amazon warehouse at Rugby for 18 months. It's really interesting that culturally, the Africans in the warehouse and the Eastern Europeans in the warehouse, they were always up for a discussion about Christianity, and I used to find that really encouraging. Well, for the last few weeks, I've been working up in Solihull in a very small office with not many people, and this is by way of encouragement because I'd been reflecting on the fact that, you know, it'd be nice to be able to share my faith with folk, and I was chatting to 2 or 3 of them during the week on Wednesday. And they were getting frustrated about some of the appalling sentencing that happens in the UK in terms of people do not seem to get the sentence they deserve for some of the atrocities that they commit. And I said, well, actually, do you know, as a Christian, I believe ultimately, unless they've repented, they will they will meet real justice when they meet their Maker. And one of them spun round and said, seriously, you believe that? And I said, I do. And then we got to chatting about the resurrection and why you can believe it. And then we explored all sorts of things. And then I just said, out of interest, I said, I'm preaching on Sunday. I said, let me just throw my introduction to you and see if it would keep you listening. And I gave them my introduction. They said, oh, yeah, go on, tell us what the sermon's about. And so I hadn't got my notes, and I had a chance to sort of explore it with them. And then on Friday, I was in a meeting, and there was only 3 of us in the office. And somebody asked, one of the other 2 asked what I was doing at the weekend. And I said, oh, I'm going out with Patrick to sort some car stuff out on Saturday, and then preaching on Sunday morning. Oh, what are you preaching on? And so I then got a chance to redo the sermon again. And so it's just by way of encouragement. Just, you never know, do you? But just take the opportunities when the Lord gives you the opportunity to share something of him with others. And I don't know how the conversations will go on this week. We'll see. Maybe pray that I'll get an opportunity. Somebody said, how does it go? And I can explain a bit more. Anyway, sermon time. Don't you just love Jesus? We sang this morning about loving him. There are multiple events and incidents in the gospel that just leave us standing in awe of him. And this morning we're going to look at a passage in Mark's gospel that shows us how incredible he was in the way that he dealt with his opponents and his enemies. And he gives a masterclass in handling their opposition and leaves us marvelling at his greatness. And it is yet another reason just to fall down before him and to worship him and love him. But here's my introduction, and here's what I used with the folk at work. I'm going to ask you a question. A man built a rectangular house. Each side had a southern view. He spotted a bear. What colour was the bear? Any ideas? White. Okay. Would you like to explain why? Exactly. Yeah. So the only way a house could have 4 southern views is if it's on the North Pole, and you only get polar bears in the Arctic, and they are white. So some questions, perhaps like that one, are a bit of fun, aren't they? It's fun trying to kind of answer them. It's fun listening and watching other people trying to answer them. Other questions, though, are far more hostile, and they're very uncomfortable for the person being questioned. And you only have to think of the interviewing style of somebody like John Humphreys when he was on Radio 4's Today programme, or Jeremy Paxman when he was on Newsnight. Their questioning was tough. It was famously, or perhaps infamously, tough, and it was designed to put pressure on people. It was designed to expose weakness in their positions or inconsistencies in their arguments. And There's a famous example of Paxman's interviewing technique all over the internet, dates back to 1997, when the then Home Secretary, Michael Howard, was asked a question, and he was evasive. And Howard's evasiveness resulted in Paxman asking that question 14 times. And pundits reckoned that it very much damaged Howard's reputation. Well, in today's passage, Jesus is faced with some hostile questioning. It was pre-planned and it was designed to trip him up. And the intention was to cause him or cause damage to his reputation, both with the public and with the ruling Roman authorities. And the way that Jesus dealt with it was incredible, because he flipped things and he showed them his masterly authority. Things were hotting up in Jerusalem. The events that we read in Mark chapter 12 take place on either the Tuesday or the Wednesday of the week of Jesus' crucifixion. On the preceding Sunday, he'd ridden into Jerusalem to be greeted by the adoration of the crowds. That incensed the Pharisees, who told Jesus to rebuke his disciples. Jesus, with good reason, refused. The next day, Jesus cleared the temple, driving out the merchants and reminding people that the temple was a house of prayer. Again, the religious authorities were outraged, and they began to look for ways to kill Jesus because they hated him that much. And next, they confronted him about his authority. But he then put them on the hook instead. And then he had the audacity to tell them the parable of the tenants, which was directly or directed specifically against them. So the religious authorities, the scribes, the Pharisees, they wanted to get rid of Jesus. They wanted him dead. But the trouble was, the public loved him, and they feared the public. And so in verse 12, which we didn't read, those authorities had effectively gone away to lick their wounds and to rethink and revise their strategy. And what we have in the passage we read are three separate questions that Jesus was asked in an attempt to discredit him in the eyes of the public and cause him problems with the occupying Roman authorities. The Pharisees, Herodians, Sadducees, and teachers of the law set three traps for him. And we're going to look at each of those in turn. Firstly, there was the trap of allegiance in verses 13 to 17. Secondly, there was the trap of heaven on earth in verses 18 to 27. And then thirdly, there was the trap of priorities in verses 28 to 34. So the trap of allegiance, the trap of heaven on earth, and the trap of priorities. So let's begin with the trap of allegiance. And the first thing to notice about this question is who asked it. In verse 13, we're told that it was a group of Pharisees and Herodians who were sent to trap Jesus in his words. If there ever was an unholy alliance in first century Israel, this was it. The Pharisees saw themselves as the upholders of the law of God and all their verbal additions to it. They viewed themselves as conservative purists, whereas the Herodians were almost opportunistic secularists. They were supporters of the puppet King Herod, whom the Romans had given some jurisdiction, some authority over the state of Israel. The Pharisees were nationalists who endured and probably hated the Roman occupation, whereas the Herodians accepted it and thrived under it. Now, normally, those two groups would have detested each other, but their mutual hatred of Jesus brought them together in this unholy alliance in which they worked together to try and get rid of Jesus. Both of them viewed him as a greater threat to their authority than they viewed the other side. And so they got together and put aside their differences and decided to trap him. Now, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Jesus is still hated today. Nowadays, it's his followers that face the wrath of his detractors, so that individuals and churches are persecuted in different parts of the world. And we too may find ourselves facing opposition at some point in time, as individuals or as a church. We've got to be prepared for that. We don't know what lies ahead. Jesus changed the status quo, and he still does. And people don't like that. And so they push back against it. We live in a society that, for the last few generations, has abandoned all pretense of Christianity and following God. And it means that Christians are marginalised, both in public spheres, in workplaces, as they try to honour Jesus. Jesus is still hated. Well, having joined forces in their mutual hatred of Jesus, the Pharisees and the Herodians led him into what they no doubt thought was a very clever trap, a cunning plan. As James said, they flattered him, didn't they? In verse 14, you're a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are. You teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. All of that was absolutely true, but they didn't believe a word of it, sadly. It was just part of their ploy to draw Jesus in. And then at the end of verse 14 and the beginning of verse 15, they sprung their trap. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we or shouldn't we pay? Now, in their minds, it was a very clever question, needing an either-or answer. If Jesus answered yes, they'd got him. If he answered no, they'd got him as well. You may recall, towards the end of her time in office, Margaret Thatcher introduced something known as the community charge, or the poll tax, as it was more commonly known. And it resulted in protests and, in some cases, riots across the country. It was a tax that was loathed by many. And John Major, when he succeeded her, got rid of it almost immediately. In first century Israel, the Romans introduced a poll tax, and it too was similarly loathed. The annual tax had to be paid in the Roman emperor's silver coins, and on those coins there was an image of the emperor and an inscription that described him as either divine or a semi-divine being. So not only was it an economic burden, it was, for many Jews, the Pharisees included, tantamount to blasphemy because of what was written on the coins. And they figured that if Jesus' answer was to pay the tax, he would cause great public offence, and the Pharisees could accuse him of supporting the blasphemous Roman system. On the other hand, if he challenged the tax, then the Herodians could accuse him of sedition, sedition against the state, which was an offence punishable by death. It seemed, therefore, that there was very little room for Jesus to manoeuvre. And to coin a metaphor, it was kind of heads they win, tails he loses. What was he to do? Well, Jesus' answer was both masterly, clever, and profound. They presented him with an either-or question, and he answered both and, which amazed them. In answering them, he asked for a coin in verse 15, thereby demonstrating he did not possess the offensive item, but they did. Okay? And then he asked them whose portrait and inscription was on it. Caesar's. So give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Jesus, in his answer, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, granted some legitimacy to the Roman government. But he doesn't side with those who say they didn't have to comply with the state's demands. But secondly, in that instruction, give to what is God to what is God's, he sets limits on the state. He allowed for the paying of taxes, but he distinguished between God and Caesar, thereby denying Caesar's claim to divine supremacy. The state has legitimacy, but it's limited, and loyalty to God must be put above all else. The coin was made in the image of Caesar, give it back to him. Men and women are made in the image of God, therefore we must give ourselves to him. So perhaps two questions we should ask ourselves as we reflect on Jesus' answer. Are we fulfilling our obligations to the governing authorities? Are we law-abiding tax-paying citizens and so on. But the second question is much more profound. Are we fulfilling our obligations towards God, in whose image we're created? Is God sovereign in my life? Does he have my total obedience? Because that's his right. Give to God what is God's. Let's move on now and look at the second trap, the trap of heaven on earth. And we find that in verses 18 through to 27. I'm going to show my age now. Nearly quarter of a century ago, back in the year 2000, the rock band U2, I don't know whether you're fans of U2 or not, but the rock band U2 released one of their most acclaimed albums of their career. It was called All You Can't Leave Behind, and it contained some very well-known tracks, such as Beautiful Day, which I would be surprised if you haven't heard as backing music on multiple TV shows. But there's one track on that album, the opening lyrics of which could be used as an opener for the Sadducees. They could have written this, the Sadducees, and the opening lines of this song go like this: heaven on earth, we need it now. I'm sick of all this hanging around. You see, the second trap for Jesus was set by the Sadducees, who didn't believe in resurrection. They were also religious leaders in Israel, but they were very different to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were concerned about the law of God and all their additions to it. They added detail after detail after detail, and they were fastidious in their legalistic keeping of it. The Sadducees, whilst also religious leaders, were very different. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they rejected the rest. And because in their minds they could find very little reference in those first 5 books to eternal life, they rejected the idea of resurrection, of angels, or spirits. And what mattered, therefore, to them was the here and now. Heaven on earth, we need it now, to quote that U2 song. So there's little wonder that the Sadducees were actually wealthy and powerful. For them, heaven effectively needed to be on earth. And they were the aristocrats of the Jews. They wielded the power in the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish religious council. And they too found Jesus a threat to the status quo. In fact, it was only a day or two earlier that Jesus had driven the merchants and the money changers out of the temple. The Sadducees controlled the temple business. And so it's no wonder they were upset, because Jesus' actions had cut into their profits and undermined their public credibility. So they too wanted to trap Jesus. He had made them look ridiculous, so now it was their turn to discredit him. And in their question, they tried to undermine Jesus by posing a hypothetical situation which proved to them the concept of resurrection to be a nonsense, or so they thought. They built a theology on a really peculiar question. So we get this story of a brother who dies with his succession of brothers who try to keep the family name alive by each marrying the widow in turn. They based the hypothetical question on Deuteronomy chapter 25. How ridiculous, they suggested, that if the law of Moses instructed a man to marry his dead brother's wife, that there could be resurrection, because you don't know who's married to whom in heaven. And to them, there were clear implications of this instruction in Deuteronomy, and one of them was that the resurrection didn't make sense. Now, in reality, theirs was a nonsense question. It was just really quite bizarre, and it was maybe as useful as asking whether Adam had a belly button or not. It was bonkers, but they built their theological position on it against the resurrection. But despite this, Jesus dignified their question with a response and pointed out that they'd incorrectly assumed that life in heaven was like life on earth. And Jesus dealt with them extremely firmly in his answer. He told them in verse 24 they were in error for 2 reasons. They didn't know scriptures, and they didn't know the power of God. It was a damning indictment. They were in error because they didn't understand the scriptures. Their experience of God was limited. There isn't marriage as we know it now in heaven. And what's more, the very books that the Sadducees took as being authoritative actually demonstrate that there is resurrection, that there is life after death. Because when God spoke to Moses, he said he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's the God of the living, not the dead. Therefore, there was life beyond the grave for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so from scripture that they took as authoritative, Jesus pointed out to them that they were badly mistaken. So rather than undermining Jesus, the opposite occurred, and they found themselves looking ridiculous. But in a matter of days, their position on the resurrection would be undermined even further, because Jesus himself rose from the dead, and news of his resurrection spread around Jerusalem, causing the Sanhedrin all sorts of problems. And in the early chapters of Acts, which we're about to shortly look at on a Wednesday evening, they're full of the examples of the Sanhedrin in meltdown as they try to stamp out the story, the good news of Jesus and the resurrection. It became a nightmare for them. But there's a warning for us. If we don't have a belief and a confidence in the resurrection, we'll fall into the same trap of looking for heaven on earth. It's the snare of only living for the here and now. And so we start to look for pleasure, power, status, success, wealth, health. We live in a society that doesn't believe in the resurrection. And as a consequence, it's a hedonistic, pleasure-driven society that often seeks instant gratification, that tries, it's laughingly sad, so tries to reclaim youth, to put off old age with all sorts of bizarre surgeries and whatever else. But it's because there's no belief in eternity. There's no belief in the resurrection. It's trying to have heaven on earth. It's a trap. Okay, so we move on and look at the third trap, the trap of priorities, which is in verses 28 to 34. Now, perhaps the first thing to notice about this third question, or the first thing to ask about it, was it actually another attempt to trap Jesus? Mark doesn't make it particularly clear for us. The first question was an unambiguous trap, and Jesus said so in verse 15. And then the second question was a bizarre attempt to undermine the concept of eternity and make Jesus look ludicrous. But that didn't work. But this third question seems to have a softer tone to the narrative. In verse 28, the teacher of the law heard the debate, recognized Jesus had given good answers, and so he asks his own question. Was it genuine? Some think that perhaps it was. I'm going to suggest that it was still, at least initially, an attempt to draw Jesus in and to trap him. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the same account in Matthew's Gospel, it says this: hearing Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, which is the greatest commandment. So Matthew tells us that it was a test. And then if we just look at the final verse we read in Mark, in verse 34, it says, from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. Now, I can understand them not daring to ask any more questions if they were trying to trap him and trick him, because they'd just been flipped. They'd just been made to look ludicrous. But I can't think that anyone would have genuinely not wanted to ask Jesus a question if it was a genuine question. So that's my reason for saying I think, at least initially, this question was an attempt to trap him. So the man came up to Jesus. He was teacher of the law. He was well versed in all the finer detail of Old Testament law and all the additions that the Jews had put onto it. And so detailed was their understanding and the way they interpreted the Old Testament that they had said that in the first 5 books of the Bible there were 613 commandments, one commandment for every letter in the 10 commandments. And of these 613, 248 were positive commandments and 365 were negative commandments. And then they subdivided these laws into heavy and light categories. And the heavier ones are obviously more important and more binding than the lighter ones. But the scribes and rabbis couldn't actually agree among themselves how heavy some of them were and how light some of them were. So in asking his question, the man may have been endeavouring to do a number of things. One, proving that maybe Jesus was out of kilter with conventional thinking and orthodox thinking, and also perhaps that he didn't actually have a mastery of all of this kind of detail of the law. So as I say, it was maybe an attempt to expose weakness in Jesus on those grounds. Jesus' response, however, indicated that his position was very orthodox, which meant that the Pharisees couldn't level any claim of heresy against him. And his response was threefold. The Lord is one, love the Lord with all your heart, and love your neighbour as yourself. And he fused them together into one commandment. So firstly, the Lord is one. He was laying a foundational truth that speaks of there only being one God, reaffirming the monotheistic position of the Jews. Deuteronomy chapter 6 was used as part of a prayer that the Jews recited morning and evening. The Lord is one. Jewish history was one of an ongoing battle with false gods, of being pulled into worshipping other gods, whether it's Baal, Asherah, Molech, Pharaoh, Caesar, and so on. And time and again, they needed to be pulled back to the one true God. For us too, there are competing gods. They might not have names and they might not be carved into wood or stone. They more likely go under the cover of ideas and attitudes and lifestyles. But Jesus pulled us back to the fact there is one true God and our allegiance belongs to him alone. And he then goes on to set out the nature of that worship or that allegiance in the second element of his answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus tells us that our worship of God is to involve the whole of our being, every part of us, affections, our heart, our soul, our will, our intelligence, our mind, our strength, everything. No facet of our personality is to be left out. It's total devotion. We must love him with everything we've got. And our love for God flows through to our relationships with other people, which forms the third element of Jesus' answer. Love your neighbour as yourself. Too often, the Pharisees came up with excuses to lessen the priority of loving neighbours, but Jesus took away their excuses by fusing it into one commandment. And for us too, it's inseparable. The Apostle John makes it clear in his first letter. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has seen. Whoever loves God must also love his brother. So Jesus' answer impressed this particular teacher, who then went on to follow it up with a comment about how much more important it was to love God and neighbour than to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. His encounter had brought him close to the kingdom of God, but we don't get told if he ever got there. Now, I said that it was a trap of priorities, and the teacher illustrates that by his comment about sacrifices and burnt offerings, because unless we have God as our number one priority, things will get out of kilter. We'll get our priorities wrong, and we can put other things first. So for them, it could have been their burnt offerings, their sacrifices, their tithes of mint and dill, and so on. For us, it could be other things. Equally, there is the danger for us of replacing reality with ritual. If we don't keep love of God and love of our neighbour first, we can drift into religiosity. So communion can become a ritual rather than actually remembering Christ and communing with him. Baptism can become a rite of passage and a religious observance rather than a declaration of loving obedience and identification with Christ. Worship can become a discussion about a preferred song style or particular songs rather than heartfelt joining together in worship and praise of God. Bible studies can become nitpicking debates on minutiae and detail rather than reading together and encouraging one another and spurring one another on towards love and good deeds and so on. Unless love of God and neighbour is our number one priority, then we run the danger of being trapped by dead orthodoxy and getting our priorities wrong, getting into a trap of priorities. So let me draw to a close. Here we have various groups of people gunning for Jesus, trying to trap him and discredit him. They hated him. He's still hated today. We still have groups of individuals. We still have governments that hate Jesus, hate his people, hate churches, try to discredit him and his people. It might be traps of allegiance. Here it was God and state. We're made in the image of God, and we must ask ourselves, are we fulfilling our obligations to him? Total obedience. Give to God what is God's, Jesus said. The second trap is the danger of living for heaven on earth, viewing the here and now as all that matters and not living in the light of eternity and the resurrection. So let's muse on the resurrection frequently. Muse on the cross frequently and point us to eternity so that we don't fall into to that trap of looking for heaven on earth and thinking it's all about here now. And then the third trap is one of priority, succumbing to the danger, perhaps, of putting religious ritual above the reality of serving the one true God and loving him and loving our neighbours as ourselves. So may God help us to avoid these traps and give him our allegiance, give him our future, give him our obedience. Two final comments as I close. We have a passage in which Jesus was challenged by the intellectuals of his day and not found wanting. In his answers, he amazed them, he stunned them into silence, he dealt with them in a masterly way, and I hope that it amazes us too. And if it amazes us, then we should stand in awe of him. And so I started with a question. Don't you just love Jesus? When you read passages like this, isn't it encouraging? The way he dealt with them and his opponents should just leave us standing in awe of him. And in fact, not just standing, bowing. And then secondly, we should never fear Christianity being challenged. We shouldn't shy away from questions. Christianity is not a faith to be found wanting. It's not something that requires that we abandon our intellect, but rather we use it for God. So we should pray for ourselves that we have the opportunity to answer appropriately when we're asked questions. And I hope that I answered appropriately earlier this week, or last week now, isn't it, when I was asked a question or two at work. But we should also pray too for those who are in the public arena. Pray for those that God has given responsibility to answer questions in the public arena, that they know how to answer when they're in the line of fire of hard questions. And I had a chat with John, I remember just stood here 2 or 3 weeks ago, talking about a chap called John Lennox, who's now in his 80s, who is in the public arena on a global scale, being challenged and standing his ground in terms of Christianity. We should pray for these folk, because it's not something that asks us to abandon our intellect, but to use it for the glory of God. So may God bless us as we reflect on these things.